The sound of splintering wood echoed through Whispering Creek as Quincy Yates' fist connected with the saloon wall, silencing the room of gossiping townsfolk who'd been speculating about his ability to care for the twin babies sleeping in a makeshift cradle at the back of his wagon. It was 1875, and a man like him with calloused hands that had never known the touch of an infant and a heart still raw from his sister's death was thought by all to be incapable of raising her children alone. "I reckon he'll give them up by week's end," muttered Herbert Wilson, the town banker, not quite quietly enough. "Man can't even keep his cattle from straying. What's he know about babies?" Quincy's broad shoulders tensed beneath his worn leather vest. At 32, the rancher had faced down rustlers, survived 2 droughts, and built his modest spread from nothing, but never had he felt as helpless as he did now, standing with his back to a town that had already decided his failure was inevitable. "My sister trusted me with her children," he said, his voice low but steady as he turned to face the room. "And that's all the reason I need." He settled his hat more firmly on his head, hiding the grief that still shadowed his blue eyes, and walked out into the dusty main street, the weight of his new responsibility heavier than any burden he'd carried before. The twins, barely 4 months old, were all he had left of Anna. The consumption had taken her too quickly for their father to make it from Boston, and with her final breaths, she'd made Quincy promise to raise her babies as his own. Their father, a drifter who'd disappeared after learning of Anna's pregnancy, had never been part of the equation. Quincy approached his wagon, checking on the twins nestled among blankets in a wooden apple crate padded with the softest cloth he could find. They slept peacefully, unaware of the whispers and doubts surrounding their future. Little Thomas with his tuft of dark hair like his mother's, and tiny Elizabeth with eyes the color of summer sky, Quincy's heart squeezed painfully at how much she resembled Anna. "Mr. Yates," a woman's voice called from behind him, halting his steps just as he was about to climb onto the wagon seat. He turned, not recognizing the voice, and found himself looking at a woman he'd never seen before. She stood straight-backed in a practical blue dress, her honey blonde hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. There was something in her direct gaze that suggested she wasn't from these parts, too confident, too unafraid to address a stranger directly. "I'm Faith Keller," she said, extending her hand in a surprisingly businesslike manner. "I arrived on yesterday's stage. I understand you're in need of assistance." Quincy stared at her outstretched hand for a moment before taking it briefly. Her skin was smooth but not soft. These were working hands, despite their feminine appearance. "I'm not hiring, Miss Keller," he said, even as one of the twins began to stir and whimper. Her lips curved slightly. "I believe you are, Mr. Yates, whether you realize it or not." Without waiting for permission, she moved past him to the wagon and peered at the fussing infant. "May I?" Before he could object, she lifted little Elizabeth with practiced ease, cradling her close and murmuring soft words. The baby quieted almost immediately. "I was a nurse during the war," Faith explained, meeting his astonished gaze. "And after, I worked in an orphanage in Chicago. I know children, Mr. Yates." She paused, her expression softening as she looked down at Elizabeth. "I heard about your sister in the general store this morning. I also heard the town's opinion on your situation." Quincy's jaw tightened. "The town can keep their opinions to themselves." "Indeed they could," Faith agreed mildly. "But they won't. And meanwhile, you have 2 infants who need more than one pair of hands, regardless of how capable those hands might be." The challenge in her eyes stirred something in him, pride, perhaps, or the first spark of hope since Anna's passing. Still, he hesitated. Taking on a stranger, a woman no less, to live at his ranch would set tongues wagging even more furiously. "I have references," she added, as if reading his thoughts. "And I'm willing to stay in town initially if that's more comfortable. But these children need consistency and care." Thomas chose that moment to wake fully, his cries joining his sister's softer fussing. Quincy reached for him automatically, his large hands awkward but gentle as he lifted the boy. "Do you know how to prepare their milk?" Faith asked, noticing his uncertainty. He'd been feeding them cow's milk, diluted as the doctor had instructed, but the process was messy and time-consuming. More than once, he'd feared he was doing it wrong. "I manage," he said stiffly. "I'm sure you do. But managing isn't thriving, Mr. Yates." Her voice held no judgment, only a practical assessment that was hard to resent. These little ones deserve to thrive. Quincy looked down at Thomas, who had grabbed onto his finger with surprising strength. The baby's face was reddening with hunger. 1 week, he said finally. You can come out to the ranch for 1 week. After that, we'll see. Faith nodded, a small smile of triumph barely visible. I'll gather my things and be ready when you are. An hour later, they were headed out of town, Faith seated beside him on the wagon with the twins nestled securely in her lap. The stares and whispers followed them, but Quincy found they bothered him less with Faith's straight back and determined profile beside him. It's about 5 miles to the ranch, he said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since leaving town. It's not much, but it's mine. I'm sure it's lovely, Faith replied, though her attention remained on the babies. How long have you had it? 8 years. Started with nothing but a broken-down cabin and 30 acres. Got about 200 now, and 40 head of cattle. He didn't know why he was telling her this, perhaps to prove to her, or to himself, that he wasn't the failure the town seemed to think him. That's impressive, she said, and sounded like she meant it. Building something from nothing takes determination. The praise, simple as it was, felt foreign to his ears. My sister helped, in the beginning. She kept the books, made the place livable. His throat tightened. She was always the practical one. Faith glanced at him, her gray eyes assessing but kind. And now you have her children. Yes, he said, the single word holding all his doubt and determination. Children can bring unexpected joy, Mr. Yates, even when they come to us in the hardest of circumstances. There was something in her voice, a depth of understanding that suggested personal knowledge. Quincy found himself curious about her story but didn't know how to ask. As they crested a hill, his ranch came into view, a modest but solidly built house, a good barn, corrals, and open pasture stretching to the tree line. Not the biggest spread in the territory, but respectable, and all earned through his own sweat and sacrifice. Home, he said simply, feeling an unexpected surge of pride as he saw Faith's approving nod. It's wonderful, she said, and again, her sincerity was evident. Those mountains in the distance, they're magnificent. Best view in the territory, if you ask me. They pulled up to the house, and Quincy jumped down to help Faith with the twins. Their hands brushed as she passed Elizabeth to him, and he was struck by the strange domesticity of the moment, as if they'd done this 100 times before. Inside, the house was tidy but sparse, a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and 2 bedrooms off to the side. Faith took in everything with quick, efficient glances. You'll need the 2nd bedroom for the nursery, she said decisively. Where will you sleep? The question brought him up short. He hadn't thought that far ahead. I can make up a bed in here, he said, nodding toward the main room. That will do for now. She handed Thomas back to him. Hold him a moment while I check the bedroom. We'll need to arrange it properly for the babies. As she disappeared into the smaller of the 2 bedrooms, Quincy found himself alone with the twins, one in each arm, their tiny bodies warm against his chest. Thomas had dozed off again, but Elizabeth was awake, her blue eyes staring up at him with what seemed like solemn consideration. What do you think, little one? He murmured. Is this going to work? The baby made a soft sound, her tiny hand reaching up to touch his whiskered cheek. His heart constricted painfully. How could something so small hold so much power over him already? Faith returned, her sleeves already rolled up. The room will do nicely, though we'll need proper cribs soon. For tonight, we can fashion something from what's available. She paused, noticing his expression. Are you all right, Mr. Yates? He swallowed hard. Yes, they're so small. Her face softened. Yes, they are, but they're stronger than they look. She approached, gently taking Elizabeth from him. Now, I believe these little ones are hungry, and you mentioned you have milk in the spring house. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of activity. Faith organized the bedroom, creating a makeshift nursery with an efficiency that left Quincy both impressed and slightly overwhelmed. She seemed to anticipate the baby's needs before they arose, handling their feedings and changes with practiced ease. By nightfall, Quincy found himself seated at his kitchen table, watching as Faith prepared a simple supper from the provisions in his pantry. The twins were asleep in their temporary beds, wooden drawers pulled from the dresser and padded with blankets. You're good at this, he said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. She glanced up from the pan of cornbread she was cutting. "I've had practice." A shadow crossed her face briefly. After the war, there were many children left without parents. "Is that why you worked at the orphanage?" She nodded, bringing plates to the table. "I felt needed there. Useful." She sat across from him. "But the orphanage closed 3 months ago, lack of funds. When I saw the advertisement for a schoolteacher in Whispering Creek, it seemed like a sign." "Schoolteacher?" Quincy raised his eyebrows. "I thought that I came here specifically to help you." Faith smiled slightly. "No, that was coincidence. Or perhaps providence, depending on your beliefs. I'm to start at the schoolhouse next month when the term begins. So this arrangement is temporary by necessity," she finished for him. "Though I'm happy to help for as long as I can, even after school starts. These little ones have already captured my heart." Quincy found himself studying her as they ate. Faith Keller was not what he would have called a beautiful woman by conventional standards. Her features were too strong, her manner too direct. But there was something compelling about her gray eyes and the quiet confidence with which she moved through the world. "Where are you from originally, Miss Keller?" "Pennsylvania," she replied. "My father was a doctor. He taught me much of what I know about caring for others." "And your family now?" Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "I lost my parents to influenza in '67. My brother died at Gettysburg." She resumed eating, her tone matter-of-fact despite the weight of her words. "I've been making my own way since." Quincy nodded, understanding more than he could express about the burden of carrying on alone. "I'm sorry for your losses." "As I am for yours," she replied simply. After supper, as Faith washed the dishes, a cry came from the makeshift nursery. Quincy rose automatically, but Faith gestured for him to sit. "Finish your coffee," she said. "I'll see to them." But he found himself following her anyway, watching from the doorway as she lifted Thomas, who was the one fussing. Her movements were sure but gentle, her voice a soft murmur of comfort as she checked his diaper and found it dry. "He's just wanting some attention, I think," she said, turning to find Quincy there. "Would you like to hold him?" Without waiting for an answer, she placed the baby in his arms. Thomas looked up at him, his cries quieting to hiccuping sobs that gradually subsided as Quincy rocked him awkwardly. "There you go," Faith encouraged. "He knows your family." The word struck Quincy like a physical blow. Family. These children were his family, now the only bloodkin he had left in the world. The responsibility of it pressed down on him with fresh urgency. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice barely audible. Faith's hand came to rest lightly on his arm. "Yes, you can, Mr. Yates. Not alone. Perhaps few parents do it entirely alone, despite what people might think. But you can do this." Her eyes held his, steady and certain. "And for what it's worth, I think your sister chose well when she trusted you with her children." Something inside him eased at her words, not the weight of responsibility, but the crushing doubt that had accompanied it since Anna's death. He nodded once, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. That night, as Quincy made up his bed on the floor of the main room, he listened to the soft sounds of Faith moving about in the nursery, singing quietly to the twins. Her voice was clear and sweet, carrying the melody of a lullaby his own mother had sung to him in Anna. For the first time since his sister's death, he fell asleep without the hollow ache of solitude pressing against his ribs. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of crisp autumn day that promised good working weather. Quincy woke at his usual early hour to find Faith already up, one baby cradled in the crook of her arm, while she stirred something at the stove with her free hand. "Good morning," she said, looking up with a smile. "I hope I didn't wake you." "No," he assured her, running a hand through his sleep-tousled hair self-consciously. "I'm always up at this hour." "Chores to do." Faith nodded. "I've fed Elizabeth, and Thomas is next. There's coffee ready if you'd like some before you head out." The domesticity of the scene struck him again, how natural it seemed to have her there in his kitchen, caring for the children as if she'd always been part of their lives. He poured himself coffee and drank it standing by the window, watching as the first rays of sunlight touched the distant mountains. "I need to ride out to check the herd today," he said after a moment. "Won't be gone more than a few hours." "We'll be fine," Faith assured him. "Take whatever time you need." Still, he found himself reluctant to leave. lingering over breakfast and showing Faith where everything was stored information she'd largely figured out already. When he finally did mount his horse, he found himself looking back at the house more than once, an unfamiliar feeling tugging at him. The ranch had always been his refuge, his life's work and purpose. But for the first time, Quincy realized it had never truly been a home until now, with the sounds of babies' cries and a woman's voice filling the spaces that had been silent for too long. The days that followed fell into a surprisingly comfortable rhythm. Faith managed the twins with a competence that allowed Quincy to maintain the ranch work, though he found himself cutting his days shorter, eager to return to the house where she and the babies waited. He taught her about the workings of the ranch, and she taught him how to hold the babies properly, how to recognize their different cries, how to bathe them without fear of their slippery smallness. By the end of the promised week, the thought of Faith leaving was inconceivable. The twins had flourished under her care, and Quincy had begun to feel more confident in his own abilities as their uncle and guardian. "The week's up," he said as they sat on the porch after supper, the twins asleep inside. The evening air was cool but pleasant, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Faith's hands stilled in her lap. "So it is. I'd like you to stay," he said, the words coming out more abruptly than he'd intended. "At least until you start teaching. The children. They've grown used to you." She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. "And after I start teaching?" He hadn't thought that far ahead. "We could work something out. You could stay here, ride into town with me each morning." He paused, realizing how improper the suggestion might sound. "I mean, we could make appropriate arrangements. For propriety's sake." A small smile touched her lips. "Propriety is important in small towns." "It is," he agreed, though in truth, he cared less about the town's opinion now than he had a week ago. "But more important are the twins. They need stability." Faith was quiet for a long moment. "I've grown fond of them," she finally said, her voice soft. "Very fond indeed. And of the ranch." She hesitated. "And of watching you with them, Mr. Yates. You're a natural, despite your doubts." The praise warmed him unexpectedly. "Quincy," he said, "if you're staying, you might as well use my given name." Her smile widened. "Quincy," she repeated, and the sound of his name on her lips sent an unexpected jolt through him. "Then you must call me Faith." "Faith," he echoed, finding he liked the feel of it in his mouth, both the word and what it represented. Then it settled. "You'll stay." "I'll stay," she agreed, and they fell into companionable silence, watching as the last light faded from the western sky. That night, as he lay on his makeshift bed in the main room, Quincy found himself thinking of Faith's hands, capable and strong, yet gentle when they cradled the twins. He thought of her voice, warm and steady, and the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. With a start, he realized he was thinking of her not just as the twins' caretaker, but as a woman, one who had somehow begun to matter to him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The realization was troubling. Faith was here for the children, not for him, and he had never intended to marry, had built his life around the freedom of answering to no one. The last thing he needed was to complicate their arrangement with unwelcome feelings. Yet as he drifted toward sleep, it was Faith's face that filled his mind, not Anna's, not the twins, but Faith's, with her direct gaze and quiet strength. The town, predictably, began to talk as soon as word spread that Faith Keller was staying at the Yates Ranch. Herbert Wilson, passing Quincy on the street during his next supply run to town, didn't bother to lower his voice as he commented to the butcher. "Always knew Yates was smarter than he looked. Got himself a nursemaid and a woman in one fell swoop. Wonder if she knows what she's gotten herself into." Quincy's hands tightened on the wagon reins, but before he could respond, Mayor Thompson's wife approached, her expression pinched with disapproval. "Mr. Yates," she said, her voice carrying clearly down the street, "the town council is concerned about your living arrangements. A single woman residing with a bachelor, regardless of the presence of children, sets a poor example." Quincy looked down at her from the wagon seat, keeping his expression neutral despite the anger simmering beneath. "Miss Keller is providing essential care to my orphan niece and nephew, Mrs. Thompson. Care they might not survive without, given they're only 4 months old. Nevertheless, propriety must be maintained," she insisted. "Perhaps the children would be better served in a proper home with a married couple." The Millers have been hoping to adopt. The children are not available for adoption. Quincy cut in, his voice hardening. They are my family, and they will remain with me. Then perhaps you should consider a more permanent solution to your situation. Mrs. Thompson sniffed. Miss Keller is scheduled to begin teaching our children in 3 weeks. We cannot have someone of questionable moral character influencing impressionable minds. The implication struck Quincy like a physical blow. Not only were they questioning his ability to care for the twins, they were now threatening Faith's position, the very reason she had come to Whispering Creek. There is nothing questionable about Miss Keller's character, he said, his voice low but carrying. She is a woman of integrity and compassion, which is more than I can say for those who would spread malicious gossip. Mrs. Thompson's face flushed. Well, excuse me, Quincy interrupted, but I need to finish my business and get back to my family. He flicked the reins, moving the wagon forward and leaving Mrs. Thompson sputtering in the street behind him. Family. The word had slipped out naturally, and Quincy realized he had begun to think of them that way, Faith included. The thought should have alarmed him, but instead, it settled into his chest with a rightness he couldn't deny. By the time he returned to the ranch that afternoon, Quincy had made up his mind. If the town wanted to force his hand, so be it. He would protect Faith's reputation and her position, and ensure the twins remained with him, all in one decisive action. He found Faith in the garden, a broad-brimmed hat shielding her face from the sun as she harvested late tomatoes. The twins were nearby, settled on a blanket in the shade of an apple tree, Elizabeth sleeping while Thomas batted at a wooden rattle. You're back earlier than I expected, Faith said, looking up with a smile that faltered when she saw his expression. What's wrong? Quincy took off his hat, turning it in his hands. The town is talking. Her smile disappeared completely. Oh. She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. I suspected they might. They're threatening your teaching position. Faith's intake of breath was sharp. On what grounds? Moral character, he said bluntly. Mrs. Thompson seems to think our arrangement is inappropriate. A flush of anger colored Faith's cheeks. That's absurd. There's nothing improper about our situation. Not to us, Quincy agreed. But small towns run on appearances and gossip. He paused, gathering his courage. There's a simple solution. Faith raised an eyebrow, waiting. Marriage, he said, the word hanging in the air between them. Her expression froze, and Quincy hurried on. It would solve everything. You could keep your position. The twins would have a proper home by the town's standards, and you would sacrifice your freedom for convenience. Faith finished, her voice oddly flat. Quincy frowned. It wouldn't be a sacrifice. It would be practical. The moment the word left his mouth, he knew it was the wrong thing to say. Faith's face shuddered, her eyes dropping to the basket of tomatoes at her feet. I see, she said quietly. A practical arrangement. Faith, she held up a hand. No, you're right. It would be practical. The twins need stability, and I need my position. She looked up, her expression composed but distant. If you're certain this is what you want, I accept. It wasn't at all how Quincy had imagined this conversation going, though in truth, he hadn't imagined it until a few hours ago. But something in Faith's cool acceptance left him feeling hollow, as if he'd offered her less than she deserved. Good, he said awkwardly. That's good. We can ride into town tomorrow, speak to the preacher. Faith nodded, already turning back to her gardening. Tomorrow, then. That evening, the usual easy companionship between them was strained. Faith was quieter than normal, focusing her attention entirely on the twins. Quincy found himself at a loss, unsure how to bridge the sudden distance between them. After the babies were asleep, Faith joined him on the porch as had become their custom, but she sat farther away than usual, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains rather than turning to him as she normally would. Faith, he said finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. Have I offended you? She sighed, a soft exhalation that seemed to carry sadness. No, Quincy, you haven't offended me. Then why does it feel like something's broken between us? She turned to look at him then, her eyes reflecting the silver of early moonlight. Nothing's broken. I'm simply adjusting my expectations. Expectations? I had begun to think. She stopped, shaking her head. It doesn't matter. You're right that marriage is the sensible solution. I've never been one to choose sentiment over sense. Something in her words caught at him. What had you begun to think, Faith? She hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. I had begun to think that perhaps there might be something growing between us that was more than just a shared concern for the twins. Something that might, in time, make marriage more than just a practical arrangement. Her voice was steady, but he could see the vulnerability it cost her to admit this. But I was mistaken. Quincy felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. The feelings he'd been trying to ignore, trying to keep from complicating their situation, Faith had been experiencing them too. You weren't mistaken, he said quietly. Her eyes widened slightly. I wasn't. No. He moved closer to her on the bench, close enough that he could see the flecks of blue in her gray eyes. When I went to town today, all I could think about was getting back here, not just to the twins, but to you. When Mrs. Thompson threatened your position, I was angry not just because it was unjust, but because the thought of you leaving. He paused, struggling to find the words. The thought of you not being here, with us, with me. I couldn't bear it. Faith's expression softened, hope beginning to replace the careful neutrality she'd maintained since his proposal. Why didn't you say so? Because I'm not good with words, he admitted. Because I thought proposing marriage was saying it. I didn't realize how it would sound to you. Like a business arrangement, she supplied. Yes. He reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. But that's not what I want, Faith. I want a true marriage. I want a partner, a companion. He swallowed, forcing himself to speak the truth that had been growing in his heart. I want you. The smile that broke across her face was like sunrise after the longest night. Well, she said, her voice warm with emotion, that sounds considerably better than practical. Quincy laughed, relief and joy mingling in his chest. I'm glad to hear it. He sobered slightly. I know it's fast. We've known each other barely 2 weeks. But I feel like I've known you much longer. I feel the same, Faith admitted. Perhaps it's the circumstances caring for the twins together, sharing this home. Or perhaps. She hesitated. Perhaps what? Perhaps some people just fit together, right from the start. Like they were meant to find each other. The sentiment might have sounded fanciful from anyone else, but from practical, straightforward Faith, it carried the weight of truth. Quincy found himself nodding. I think you might be right. He squeezed her hand gently. So, will you marry me, Faith Keller? Not for convenience or propriety, but because I believe we could build something good together for the twins and for ourselves. Her free hand came up to touch his face, a gentle caress that sent warmth spreading through him. Yes, Quincy Yates. I will marry you. The space between them disappeared as he leaned forward, his lips finding hers in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, tender at first, then deepening as Faith's arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Quincy rested his forehead against hers. I should have done that days ago, he murmured. Faith laughed softly. Better late than never. The following morning, they rode into town with the twins, heading straight for the parsonage beside the small white church at the end of Main Street. Reverend Gardner, a kindly older man who had served the community for over 20 years, welcomed them into his study with genuine warmth. Mr. Yates, Miss Keller, he greeted them. And the little ones. How may I be of service today? We'd like to be married, Quincy said directly. As soon as possible. If the Reverend was surprised by the request, he hit it well. I see, he said, glancing between them with thoughtful eyes. Marriage is a sacred commitment, not to be entered into lightly. We understand that, Reverend, Faith assured him, her voice steady. We've given this careful consideration. The older man nodded slowly. And the children? They are a part of this decision. They're the reason we met, Quincy explained. But not the only reason we're marrying. He looked at Faith, unable to keep the affection from his expression. We believe we can build a good life together. Reverend Gardner studied them for a long moment, then smiled. Very well. I typically require a period of counseling before performing a marriage, but given the circumstances and what I know of both your characters, I'm willing to make an exception. He consulted a small calendar on his desk. Would Sunday after services suit you? Faith glanced at Quincy, who nodded. Sunday would be perfect, she said. Excellent. Now, will you be wanting a simple ceremony, or simple? They said in unison, then looked at each other and laughed. The Reverend's eyes twinkled. Simple it is, then. Just the vows and a blessing. He paused. Though I suspect news of your engagement will spread quickly. Don't be surprised if half the town shows up. They left the parsonage with a date set and a lightness in their steps that had nothing to do with the townspeople they passed. Several heads turned to watch them, and Quincy knew the gossip would be flying before they were even out of sight. Mrs. Thompson is watching from the millinery, Faith murmured, a hint of mischief in her voice. Shall we give her something to really talk about? Before Quincy could respond, Faith had risen on her toes and pressed a quick, sweet kiss to his cheek. The gesture, innocent as it was, sent heat flooding his face not from embarrassment, but from the natural, public claim she was making on him. I believe we just did, he said, grinning as he helped her back into the wagon. By the time they returned to the ranch, Quincy felt as if he were floating a few inches above the ground. The woman beside him had agreed to be his wife, to raise Anna's children with him, to build a life together on the land he loved. It seemed almost too much good fortune for one man. That night, after the twins were asleep, Faith joined him on the porch as usual, but this time she sat close beside him, her head eventually coming to rest on his shoulder as they talked about plans for the wedding and their future together. I was thinking, Quincy said, his arm around her shoulders, we should build an addition to the house. Another bedroom for when the twins are older and need their own spaces. Faith's hand rested on his chest, warm even through his shirt. That's an excellent idea. And perhaps a bigger kitchen? I've noticed it gets crowded when we're both in there. Anything you want, he promised, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. This is your home now, too. I want you to be happy here. She tilted her face up to his, her expression serious despite her smile. I already am happy, Quincy. Happier than I thought possible after losing my family. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw. You and the twins have given me something I never expected to find again: belonging. The emotion in her voice matched the feeling swelling in his own chest, a fullness that was almost painful in its intensity. He lowered his head to kiss her properly, pouring into it all the things he still struggled to say aloud. Faith responded with equal fervor, her hands sliding into his hair as she pressed closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Quincy rested his forehead against hers. Sunday seems very far away, he murmured. Her soft laugh warmed him from the inside out. Only 4 days. We've waited this long, we can wait a little longer to do things properly. He knew she was right, but it didn't make the waiting any easier. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations and anticipation. Word of their engagement spread through town exactly as the Reverend had predicted, and while some tongues still wagged with disapproval at the hasty marriage, many in the community responded with surprising warmth and support. On Saturday, a wagon arrived from town loaded with unexpected gifts: a hand-stitched quilt from the ladies' sewing circle, a rocking chair from the carpenter, and proper wooden cribs from the Hendersons, whose own children were grown. I think we've been accepted, Faith said as they arranged the cribs in the nursery, her eyes shining with emotion. Or at least, they're willing to give us a chance. All it took was committing to spend our lives together, Quincy replied with a wry smile. Simple, really. She laughed, the sound filling the room with joy. The simplest things are often the most meaningful. Sunday dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself approved of their union. They dressed in their finest clothes, Quincy in a dark suit he hadn't worn since Anna's funeral, now carrying much happier associations, and Faith in a dove-gray dress that brought out the silver in her eyes. The twins, too, were dressed in their best tiny outfits Faith had altered from clothes donated by families in town. Thomas squirmed in Quincy's arms as they stood before the altar, while Elizabeth regarded the proceedings with solemn attention from Faith's embrace. True to the Reverend's prediction, the church was filled with townspeople, some merely curious, but many genuinely supportive. Quincy barely noticed them, his attention fixed entirely on Faith as she stood beside him, her voice clear and steady as she spoke her vows. I, Faith Keller, take you, Quincy Yates, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. When it came his turn, Quincy surprised himself with the steadiness of his own voice, the absolute certainty behind the words he spoke. This wasn't merely a practical arrangement anymore, it was the most important promise he'd ever made. I, Quincy Yates, take you, Faith Keller, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. By the power vested in me, Reverend Gardner said, beaming at them, I now pronounce you husband and wife. He winked at Quincy. You may kiss your bride. Mindful of the babies in their arms and the audience around them, Quincy leaned forward to place a chaste kiss on Faith's lips. Even that brief contact sent a thrill through him, the knowledge that this remarkable woman was now his wife, that they would face whatever came next together. The congregation erupted in applause as they turned to face them, a family united before God and community. Herbert Wilson was the first to approach them after the ceremony, his earlier skepticism replaced with grudging respect. Well done, Yates, he said, shaking Quincy's hand firmly. Seems you might know what you're doing after all. He nodded to Faith. Mrs. Yates, the school board looks forward to having you begin teaching next week, as planned. Thank you, Mr. Wilson, Faith replied with dignity. I look forward to it as well. Mrs. Thompson appeared next, her pinched expression somewhat softened. A lovely ceremony, she said stiffly, and the babies look very well cared for. It was as close to an apology as they were likely to get, and Quincy accepted it with a nod. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. My wife is an excellent mother to them. The words, my wife, felt strange and wonderful on his tongue, especially when he saw the way Faith's eyes lit up at hearing them. The rest of the day passed in a whirl of congratulations and celebration. The town had organized a modest reception at the hotel dining room, with food contributed by many of the local families. It was a far grander affair than either Quincy or Faith had expected, and a clear sign that Whispering Creek was ready to embrace them as a family. Never thought I'd see the day, Hank Miller, one of Quincy's neighboring ranchers, commented as they shared a drink. You settling down, taking on a family. Anna would be proud, you know. The mention of his sister brought a pang of bittersweet emotion. I hope so, Quincy said quietly. No doubt about it, Hank assured him, clapping him on the shoulder. She always said you had more heart than you let on. Looks like she was right. By late afternoon, they were ready to return home, their home, now truly shared. Faith sat beside him on the wagon seat, Elizabeth sleeping in her arms while Thomas dozed in a basket at their feet. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the road as they made their way back to the ranch, the horses moving at a steady pace as if they, too, were eager to reach home. Are you happy, Mrs. Yates? Quincy asked, the new name still a marvel to him. Faith's smile was radiant. Completely, Mr. Yates. She leaned against him slightly. Though I'm looking forward to some quiet after all the excitement. Just wait until tomorrow, he said, only half joking. You'll be facing a classroom full of children. One challenge at a time, she replied with a laugh. Today, I became a wife. Tomorrow, a teacher. It's a lot of change in a short time. Any regrets? She looked up at him, her eyes full of a warmth that reached down to his very soul. Not a single one. As they crested the hill and the ranch came into view, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, Quincy felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. This land had been his dream, his purpose for so long. Now it was becoming something more, the foundation for a family, a legacy for the twins, a place where love could grow and flourish. Faith's hand found his on the reins, her fingers intertwining with his in a silent affirmation of all they had promised each other. Welcome home, he said softly. Home, she echoed, the word carrying all the meaning they both felt. Yes, that's exactly what it is. In the year that followed, Whispering Creek witnessed the transformation of the Yates Ranch from a bachelor's domain to a thriving family home. Faith proved to be as talented a teacher as she was a mother, winning over even the most reluctant students with her combination of firmness and compassion. Quincy, for his part, found that fatherhood suited him far better than anyone, including himself, had expected. The twins grew strong and healthy, their personalities emerging more distinctly with each passing month. Thomas was bold and adventurous, always the first to try new things, while Elizabeth showed a thoughtful nature that reminded Quincy painfully of Anna at times. Faith began a small garden that expanded with each season, providing fresh vegetables for their table and herbs for the remedies she had learned from her father. Quincy added the promised addition to the house, working alongside the town carpenter to create not just a new bedroom, but a small study where Faith could prepare her lessons and the children could eventually do their schoolwork. Through it all, their love deepened and strengthened, built on the foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose that had brought them together, but blossoming into something far richer and more profound than either had dared to hope for. On the twins' first birthday, they hosted a small gathering at the ranch, not just a celebration of the children, but a quiet commemoration of the year that had changed all their lives. The Hendersons came, and Reverend Gardner, and even Herbert Wilson and his wife, who had become unexpected allies in the community. As Faith placed a small cake before the wide-eyed twins, Quincy watched his family with a heart so full it seemed impossible it wouldn't burst from his chest. These were the moments he would have missed if he had given in to doubt, if he had listened to the town's initial judgment of his abilities. "I think your sister would be pleased," Faith said softly, coming to stand beside him as the guests mingled in the yard. "The twins are happy, healthy, and very loved." Quincy slipped his arm around her waist, drawing her close. "Thanks to you. Thanks to us," she corrected gently. "It takes both of us, Quincy. That's what makes it work." He pressed a kiss to her temple, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, lavender, and something uniquely Faith. "I have something to tell you," he murmured. "I was going to wait until after the party, but I'm not sure I can." She turned in his arms, her expression curious. "What is it?" "I heard from the bank yesterday. They've approved the loan for the additional acreage." He watched her eyes widen with excitement. "We can expand the herd next spring, just like we planned." Faith's smile was brilliant. "Quincy, that's wonderful news." Her arms tightened around him. "I'm so proud of you, of what you've built here, of what we're building together. I couldn't have done it without you," he said, the words simple but heartfelt. "Any of it." Her expression softened, a hint of mischief appearing in her eyes. "Well, I have some news for you as well, Mr. Yates. News that might require us to think about another addition to the house before too long." It took him a moment to understand her meaning, and when he did, joy surged through him like a physical force. "Faith, are you certain?" She nodded, her eyes shining. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday. Early summer, he thinks." Quincy lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace, heedless of the guests who turned to look at them with amused curiosity. When he set her down again, he kept his hands on her waist, his voice lowered for her ears alone. "I love you, Faith Yates, more than I ever thought possible." "And I love you," she replied, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek. "More with each passing day." The sound of a crash followed by Thomas's delighted laughter drew their attention back to the party, where the birthday boy had managed to upend his portion of cake onto the table. Elizabeth, more fastidious even at 1 year old, was methodically picking up pieces of frosting and examining them before eating them. Faith laughed, the sound merging with Quincy's own deep chuckle. "Duty calls," she said, but she leaned up for a quick kiss before moving to deal with the mess. Quincy watched her go, marveling yet again at how completely his life had changed in just over a year. From a solitary rancher facing an impossible task to a husband and father with a future brighter than he had ever imagined possible. The town had said he couldn't raise the twins alone, and they had been right. But they had been wrong about his capacity to love, to learn, to build a family that would thrive against all odds. With Faith beside him, there seemed no limit to what they might accomplish together. As the afternoon sun bathed the ranch in golden light, Quincy Yates looked at his family, his wife helping Thomas clean sticky fingers, Elizabeth solemnly offering a piece of cake to Reverend Gardner, the ranch hands and townspeople who had become part of their extended community and knew with absolute certainty that he had found his true purpose, his true home, his true heart. And it had all begun with 2 tiny lives and one extraordinary woman who had stepped in beside him when he needed her most.